Welcome. I'm Patricia Kranz, the Executive Director of the Overseas Press Club. Thank you for joining us for the latest program in our In the Thick of It series, which focuses on journalists covering hotspots. Tonight, we are focusing on Peru. Since early December, protests have led to the deaths of at least 48 people. They began after Congress removed President Pedro Castillo, firing up anger against the elite, especially in poor, rural Andean regions in Peru's south. The unrest is also fueled by longstanding grievances about high poverty levels and discrimination felt by many in Peru's Andean and Amazonian regions. Covering the protests has been challenging for journalists, with dozens harassed and injured. Adam Jourdan of Reuters, who is the Bureau Chief for South Latin America, will moderate the discussion. Joining him are Samantha Schmidt, Bogota Bureau Chief for the Washington Post, Alexander Villegas, Senior Correspondent for Reuters, Rodrigo Abd, a Pulitzer Prize winning photographer for the Associated Press, and three-time winner of the OPC's Best Feature Photography Award. Please feel free to put your questions in the chat at any time. I now turn it over to Adam. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Patricia. Hey, everyone, and welcome. As Patricia said with the introduction, we've seen 3 months of protests now in Peru since early December. We've had roadblocks throughout the south, that Andean south, stymieing transport of goods, stymieing mining, the shutdown of the iconic Incan ruins in Machu Picchu. A major and complex reporting challenge for anyone covering it for TV, text, or photos. With our three panelists who have spent many weeks on the ground there, I'd like to first bring them in to discuss, what it was like in, on the front line, on the ground, the very visceral experience of how they navigated some of these challenges, especially with the blockades, with roads shut down and transport very limited. Samantha, I might bring you in first. You mentioned one of your interesting stories about Machu Picchu, when they closed it down in late December, early January. It was closed for almost a month, and yet you managed to get there. Tell us a little bit about the challenges you faced and a bit about that reporting effort.
Yeah, thanks, Adam. As you mentioned, the logistical in my opinion, the logistical challenges were a huge part of this story. And though they made our jobs more difficult, I think it was really important to be able to capture how it was affecting normal people, but also how it was affecting tourism to Peru. And when I was in Lima for this, very large march in February, or I guess that was, I'm losing track of time now, January. We noticed that, we were there when they announced that Machu Picchu was closing, that the ruins themselves were closing, and that the town closest to the ruins was actually going on strike. And it was really, important to me to capture that part of the story, because it seemed to me that these, these business owners, these locals, that these union leaders were basically sacrificing their own livelihoods that depended entirely on tourism to Machu Picchu in order to send a message to the government. And so we really wanted to be able to get there to tell that story. But as you mentioned, it was quite difficult, in large part because, as any of you know who've been to Machu Picchu, the main way to get there, not the only way, but the main way that people get there is by train. And the trains had been damaged, the train tracks had been damaged in the protests. And so the only way for us to get there was to take this long route where we basically drove 5 hours in the dark. It had to be late at night because it was a specific window that we found when the roads were not going to be blocked. And even then there were, boulders on the streets. We kind of had to go around these twists and turns around these big boulders. We had this driver named Pitbull. So he was quite the character, and he got us there safely to this town called Santa Teresa, which was pretty much the closest town we could drive to. And we spent the night there at a hotel, and the next morning had to basically hike for about 3 hours along the train tracks. And that was the route that locals were having to take too, in order to get supplies and food, a route that they usually would be able to take very quickly on a train for, a very little amount of money if you're a local that lives there. Now they had to take this hike. And so we'd see people with wheelbarrows, and it was just so striking to see this completely, empty ghost town that is usually the tourist attraction to Peru suddenly, completely on strike. And we actually, to get back, we found a quicker way that was actually taking a wooden rail cart that had a motorbike on the back, which was also the way that the mayor of this town closest to Machu Picchu was getting to and from the closest town. So it just really captured to me how Peru was really at a standstill in many ways, and so is the tourism. And it was really this town was really taking a hard hit.
And just take us through the experience of when you arrived at the Incan ruins. I mean, as you say, normally you have hundreds, thousands of tourists from all over the world flocking there every day. So obviously, probably everyone on this call has seen photos or been there. I mean, are we talking? Was it completely empty, or were people filling out at the point when you arrived? What was that like?
Well, it was closed to the public, and the only way we were able to get in was through the Ministry of Culture. They basically allowed us in briefly in order to take some pictures. And I mean, to me, it was my first time in Machu Picchu, so it was incredible. But it was also really, it was really striking because there was nobody there. It was only the maintenance workers kind of mowing the grass, just the staff, but there were no tourists there. And there were a few tourists who were, who had still tried to make the trip there, who had hiked there and were waiting outside the entrance, but they weren't allowed in. And I felt quite bad for them, but we went in briefly because we wanted to, for the sake of the story, capture this place completely empty, mainly for the visuals of that, because I think it really sent this message home that, Peru was on strike. Even the place that is, I think, to many Americans and foreigners, kind of the most recognizable image of Peru. And to me, it was a way to kind of get people to pay attention. And that was really the goal of the strike for them as well, is to use this landmark to send a message to the government, even if it meant sacrificing their own livelihoods.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Samantha. Alex, I'll bring you in as well now. I mean, I know you spent several weeks on two different trips down in the south of Peru in December and in January, facing some of these same issues in terms of driving around and dealing with these roadblocks. Just to paint the picture for people who might not know it intimately, I mean, what were the roads like when you were driving through the Andes, and through these mining areas, through the southern towns? What were the roadblocks like? What were the people who were manning these roadblocks like, and what was the atmosphere?
Yeah, that's interesting because especially in the South, there were like a lot of manned blockades. And the biggest challenge was that immediately, every time we rolled up to any one of them, they were like, you're not going to pass. Like, we're not letting anyone pass. And then from there, it just became a negotiation. There's, lots of resentment towards local media. So a lot of it was just kind of explaining our job, what we were doing. We showed them previous stories we did in the past. We explained the reason why we wanted to go to this city, Juliaca. And it depended, it varied. Sometimes it would just take a few minutes of talking. I think the longest time we were held up was 3 hours. And that was in this mining corridor blockade, which was quite high. It was 4,700 meters, which is like about 15,000 feet. And that was the one we got stuck at for a while. And the altitude turned out to be a big challenge there. And somebody in our team got sick, altitude sickness. So that was actually a surprising challenge. And when we were out interviewing, when we were out talking with people, it suddenly hit all of us kind of at the same time. And then it just became kind of learning how to deal with that, also adapting. They have a nice local solution, agua florida, which is this kind of alcohol you put on your hands and you smell. That is like a local solution to deal with altitude and coca tea, which helped a bit. For us, the biggest challenge was just also the patience of blockade after blockade after blockade, and knowing that in each one, you didn't know how long you were going to stay there. You had to stay friendly. You had to stay conversational. sometimes some people would let you through, and then a person would come in at the last minute and be like, I don't want them to come through. And then it would have to turn into convincing that person. So yeah, that was kind of, yeah, and then the roads were just completely filled with debris, rocks. So even the unmanned blockades, that's why it was essential to go during the day, because at night you never knew what hazards were gonna kind of be on the road.
You mentioned the hostility to reporters. Just on that point, did you face any sort of hairy moments like that in your reporting, either on the roads or in the towns? Were there any challenging moments that you had to navigate?
Yeah. So most of the time it was fine. When we explained that we were international press, what we were there doing, people would understand, and the tides would turn and they would be very friendly for us. But we kind of got attacked by protesters in Juliaca because there wasn't a lot of a time to explain during this protest. And there was one instance where there was this kind of drunk protester who took it against our cameraman, and he riled up the crowd against him, and there was no time to really calm things down. They kind of threw a rock at him and started kicking him, and we got out of that situation. And then later in that same thing, we saw them kind of steal a phone of a local reporter, and that's when we knew we needed to get out. But during that exit too, this one woman kind of accused me of being like an infiltrator. I should have, looking back, kind of talked to her and stopped, but we just kept going to the car to kind of leave. And then in that instance, she kind of riled up more people against us, and they kind of chased our car down. And yeah, it was kind of hairy because we had to go through protesters. The ones in front of us, we kind of started telling them that we were press, and then while this big mob was forming in the back chasing us, and luckily we got out in time there.
And just to add some context on that, Juliaca, which you mentioned, was the site of the worst single day of violence that Peru protests have seen in January, where there were, I think, 17 people killed in a single day. Thank you for that, Alex. Rodrigo, I'll bring you in for your experience, covering the protests from the visual side. I read once that you said covering Peru was more complicated and tougher than covering Afghanistan. Just curious how you dealt with this hostility and how you managed to overcome it in your coverage.
Hello. Well, I think that people in generally in Latin America, but in Peru these days, people don't believe in the local media. So there is a lot of anger against the local media because protesters said that the local media lie and they don't tell the truth of what is going on, that they are like supporting the government, and they are not saying that this was like a coup, not military, well, like a military coup or something like that. So it's very difficult to arrive and to try to explain that we are not local media, that we work for the international media, and that we don't have any political agenda, and we try to be as honest and as professional as possible to tell this complex story. It's a very complex story. I lived in Peru for almost 9 years. And there is a lot of conflicts that are mixing. It's the mining conflict in the south. It's the first time that these Aymaras and Quechua indigenous people elected a president. And everybody knows that the president was not really doing a good government, but at the end, he was elected by these guys, by these people. The people are really angry because they think that even it was not a great president, it was the president that they elected. So we are talking in this story about very old problems in Peru, about discrimination, about the indigenous people being always at the back of the decisions in Lima. So we are facing these problems all together. At the end, what I felt in Peru while living there I was coming from Guatemala, and I thought that Peru was very quiet because it was really a place that there was a lot of things going on, but it never erupted like now. And now it's this country that is growing economically, but the inequality is incredible. So the economy is growing for 20 years, and people are not facing those benefits. So there are a lot of things going on today in Peru. It's not only Castillo, it's Castillo, inequality, racism, the historical problems of Peru. Remember that in that part of Peru, in the south, was the biggest revolution against the Spanish empire, like Tupac Amaru, the place that now is facing all these clashes and all these dead people is the place where Tupac Amaru led the rebellion against the Spanish people. So I think it was interesting for me to go back and to see this in Peru. Almost everything is going on there now. It's crazy, and it was nice because I lived there for 9 years. Now I left, but I have a lot of friends, colleagues, and I really love the country, and it's very interesting for a journalist, but it's very bad for people. You know, the economy is going down. Lots of local people, the people that are like facing the blockades of the protesters, they support the protest, but at the same time they are suffering. You know, they can't work, most of them. It's very difficult to move. It's very difficult to move products from community to community, not only big companies. Like, people are suffering this.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
You mentioned an interesting element about the revolution and the history that the south of Peru has. I mean, how do you see that this time? I mean, you know, we're not necessarily at revolution yet, but this has marked a bit of a pivot point for Peru. It's the worst violent episode they've had in maybe over 20 years. Things have calmed down a bit in the recent weeks, but there's still in Puno, in other parts of the south, there's still a lot of unrest and a lot of anger. There's still not clarity around elections and what happens with Boluarte, the current president, and Congress, who both of whom are very unpopular with the people. What do you see happening next? I mean, with Peru, where does Peru go?
Well, I think that this is not finished. Probably protesters got tired after like almost like two months of being in the streets. I think that the government has to call a new election day, so people, at least people that are angry, will think that there is an opportunity of a new election in 3 or 4 months. But you know, they are trapped in the Congress. You know, they don't move forward. So I think that if the government is not going to call election, there are still going to be protests in the streets, in the south of the country. This is not going to stop. People are so angry that I don't think this is going to stop. Hopefully, we hope it's going to be more peaceful than in December and January, but the political situation is not going to change. I think it's going to be very unstable for the next month. Because you know, on the Washington Post, I think Samantha, they wrote a great story in Ayacucho about what I am talking. It's not a problem that started now with Castillo. It's like a lot of things going on. It's not only Tupac Amaru, then you have to think in the 80s, in the almost civil war that was in Peru with the Shining Path and the government. So in that place I don't know, Samantha, how many people were killed in Ayacucho? More than,
I mean, yeah, it was the largest death toll was there. I think it was 69,000 total around the country is the estimate of the dead. But I mean, Ayacucho for sure, I think 40% of them, of the deaths were there. And they still are dealing with the repercussions of that and the suspicion and the accusations of being terrorists, and all of that is coming to the surface again.
So Adam, so the Washington Post did a great. So I was thinking in Machu Picchu, and they did that story, and then they did a story about Ayacucho.
Well, so did Alex. We were. I think Ayacucho was.
Sam, I wanted to ask you about that because you mentioned this, some of the reporting you did in Ayacucho, especially speaking with the families and looking at the violence that occurred there. Take us through a little bit about that and the complexities of finding the families, of getting them to talk. I mean, this was to explain as well that Ayacucho was the scene of the second worst single day in December, which was the first really big bad one. When around a dozen people were killed in clashes between protesters and police and military around an airport in the city. Tell us about the reporting you did there and the challenge in talking to people, getting them to trust you and share things with you.
Yeah, I mean, we showed up more than a month after the large protest that you mentioned, you know, when 10 people died in basically one day on December 10th. Believe. And what was so striking to me was, you know, even a month and a half later, they were still so traumatized. And what we wanted to try to capture was, you know, in this place that was the epicenter of the conflict, you know, 40 years ago, kind of how all of those wounds are being reopened through this, and for the families who were, you know, the families of the victims. And we spoke, you know, it basically started off for me as just an interview with the woman who I'd heard was the kind of one of the family members organizing the other relatives of the victims to try to demand justice, to try to get attention, you know, when at this point, attention had kind of turned to other parts of the country. Ayacucho had quieted down, but these families still hadn't gotten answers. They still hadn't, you know, felt that the authorities were investigating these deaths properly. And this woman starts talking to me about her husband who died. And in this conversation, she also tells me that, you know, a week after, basically when her husband was shot, she ended up donating blood. She didn't tell anyone at the time that she was pregnant. And a week after her husband died, she lost 2 unborn twins that, you know, she hadn't told anyone about that at that point. You know, she'd shared some of her story about her husband, but she just started kind of opening up to me. And I was like, so caught off guard by the you know, the heaviness of her story and the just absolute like tragedy that it was, and how in the middle of all of that, she was picking herself up and organizing other families and helping them get to, you know, group therapy, and, you know, both working through that grief and that trauma, but also trying to demand action. And, you know, it to me was so clear also how she was dealing with, you know, in the middle of all of that, a lot of threats against her life, people accusing her of being a terrorist, of, you know, being associated with terrorist groups, which is, you know, a narrative that was being shared at the highest levels of government. And that I think was really re-traumatizing for people in Ayacucho, because that was always kind of the, you know, the scarlet letter on them during the conflict, and to this day, it was really a stronghold of the shining path of Jaime Guzman. And, you know, so they can't get rid of that that past. And still today, even this woman who is, you know, a family member of a victim is still being told that she's a terrorist, and had people show up at her house and harass her. And so when she was talking to me, it was clear, you know, that first day she opened up and she was comfortable talking about it. And we had planned to spend the whole weekend with her and, you know, follow her around the next day. And she just, the next day she stopped responding to my messages. She seemed really exhausted. She had a lot on her plate. She was, you know, meeting with human rights researchers who were asking, so many people were asking so much of her, and it became clear that this was just adding more to her plate. And so we had to kind of know when to step back and to stop making it even harder on her. And so, you know, something that we, a lot of times in journalism, I think we expect we're going to get this much, and you get this much with somebody, and it's okay. You know, we made the most of what we got with her, and we were able to, you know, kind of stay in touch over the phone. And I think her story, even the little bit of it that that I got, kind of captured the level of grief that these people were dealing with long after the initial, aftermath of the protest.
Thank you, Sam. Alex, I'll bring you back in. I know you also spent time in Ayacucho as well as Juliaca. One of the allegations that has been thrown at the government and the security forces is, this use of excessive force, use of live ammunition. A lot of the dead in their autopsies were found with, the bullet wounds from live weaponry. Alex, you looked into a couple of cases in Ayacucho. Just take us through how you developed that reporting, to try and piece together what had really happened on the ground. There was obviously a lot of uncertainty. There was a lot of, a lot of different takes from different sides, from the government, as you're all saying, calling a lot of the protesters terrorists, and the view from the protesters themselves. But tell us how you picked that apart and tried to distill it, Alex.
Yeah, so we went to Ayacucho in December. So that was a few days after, it was the first large scale death event that happened there. And there still wasn't kind of a lot of information about what had happened. And the military, kind of what they put out was, that there was this clash at the airport and one of their units got attacked and they were forced to use lethal force. And that was kind of, what was out there when we went. And then, we decided to go to the airport and we had the sign that said international press in the car. Photographer and the videographer were out taking some shots, and some just passerby asked me if I was international press, and I said yes. And he was like, do you know that they killed a bunch of people down at this corner? And I was like, no. And he was like, well, I can show you the bullet holes and the bullets. And then we went down there, and then coincidentally, and then a story started emerging about kind of that conflicted with what the official military account, that, there had been this fire, there had been a lot of shootings at that, out in residential streets for hours after this kind of protest at the airport took place. And that's, we met a woman who was having a mourning event for her brother who got killed. And, she was saying that they were just kind of in their house that day. And yeah, there was bullet holes outside their house. And she said her brother got shot right outside there when he was trying to help another protester. And a lot of people had similar stories. So I noticed that there was kind of security cameras around, and a few of them belonged to the local municipality. So we went there, and then they gave us the footage. Conveniently, the one that would have captured all of this was not working. So then we went looking around, and then I found a store that had a security camera, and it took some negotiating and talking with the woman to telling her why we wanted the footage. We weren't police, we weren't investigators. We just kind of wanted to show everyone what happened. And in that footage showed this man kneeling over this protester. Everyone runs away and he gets shot while kneeling down and falling. And that footage went very viral in Peru, and all the local newspapers picked it up, and they questioned the president about it too, because it was it was a very simple image that very much disproved kind of what the narrative had been, and this narrative that Samantha was talking about that was so easily kind of placed on this city, these people that have long been looked at by the capital, by people in Lima as, with that history of terrorism, with that lens. And they were very quick to paint those deaths and the protests with that broad brush. And then this kind of started breaking that down. So that was our main kind of story that did there. And I remember, I think as you do, it was right before Christmas. And I think we published it on the day after Christmas, maybe. But then, yeah, and then Juliaca, it was kind of a similar tale there about just kind of this widespread, this one day that things just got out of control, and that led to a massive death toll, and just kind of the value of going there and trying to piece together what happened when there's so much chaos, and find one or two kind of events that kind of tell the story and try to bring more light to what happened. And it's kind of, what's interesting is that the December event was already, 4 months ago, and people are still clamoring for justice. That despite this evidence, there has been no, what a lot of families say, no kind of progress on investigations, or they haven't been told what's going to happen.
Thank you, Alex. Rodrigo, I'll bring you back in quickly. I mean, obviously you've taken very vivid and very arresting photos all over the world. Was there an image or a particular story or a moment that stood out for you in your coverage of the Peru protests?
I think that the most interesting for me for pictures was the life around the blockades of the protesters, because you can see like a lot of interaction between, you can understand why they do that and how people do things to pass through the blockades. And you saw like amazing moments of pregnant women like walking with their kids and families all together passing through the blockades under the rain. It's a rainy season in the south of the country. So it was very dramatic to see those civilians. After all, I think that in every conflict, the most interesting thing for me as a photographer is to show the common people, not the police operations or the military operations, or probably the clashes between, because those clashes everybody likes to photograph the clashes and they are very well published, but they don't really sometimes tell the complexity of the event. And I think that for me, it's more important to focus in the normal people, in the families, in the those millions of Peruvians that were like trying to struggle, and the life was really difficult for them. People doing lines in Cusco, people doing lines for 10 hours. One day, people were like sleeping to get gas for cooking for almost 2 days sometimes. So to show all these different moments for me was really important, to see people doing lines for gas, lines for in the gas stations, people like closing the markets very quickly because the protests erupted and they feel that some lootings probably were going to be in the towns. So the daily life of Peruvians was so affected that I think that for me, in terms of pictures, was interesting to show that the daily moments of the protesters. And I don't know, I think that probably it was my part, because I couldn't go in December. That was probably the most violent part of the protest. I went there when things were more calm. At the same time, it was a lot of doubts about if the president was going to renounce, or if they're going to be changed in the government. So it was a good moment to do daily life in a way.
Thank you, Rodrigo. One last kind of question for all of you, before we can maybe throw open to questions. Sort of a more personal question, which is when you were covering, while you were covering this sort of event where it's highly emotionally charged, you have a lot of grief amongst the communities that you're covering. There are some physical challenges, physically getting around, finding places, getting gas, getting food, the altitude that you mentioned, Alex. How do you make sure that you look after yourself, both your mental and your physical health, and how did you cope with that in Peru? Maybe Rodrigo, will start with you, and then we can circle back to Sam and Alex.
It's in Peru it's very challenged to work, because the altitude in the south was like, I spent almost 30 Alex, you said like 3 hours. Well, I spent like 34 hours to go back from Puno, Juliaca to Cusco, because I didn't want to get through all these blockades, the biggest ones in the normal road. So I went through all the mountain, and I had to sleep in the middle of nowhere. It was freezing with a local driver. It was complicated. It's it was very cold, rainy, and I didn't have a good vehicle, so we didn't know when the car was going to break in the middle of the mountain. It was, almost all the markets were closed, so it was very difficult sometimes to find a place to eat, to find people to, in the middle of nowhere, to tell you where was the road, where I can go, because what was the blockade more friendly to talk to them, and then you're right there, and you want to get through, but you spend like 3 hours talking to the people, and then the people wanted to do a ceremony, so they say, okay, please record these, take pictures of these, because if not, you don't get through the blockade. So it was a whole, ceremony for us also too. But it was nice also because we connected in another way with people. We live those moments with them also. We understood better the story. It was more complicated to work. It was more difficult, but at the same time, it was good to go to these remote towns and to talk to people and to spend time, because you need to talk. They want to explain you, and when they know that you are not local media, they want you to understand the whole problem, so they start talking. So yeah, it was interesting but very challenging.
Sam, maybe throw over to you, and I might add in the kind of the additional question is: was there any sort of survival kit that you took with you? Any key things that you had in your bag that you needed, and but also how you dealt with the fatigue and also the mental strain?
Yeah, I mean that like last minute hike to Machu Picchu, it was a very kind of spontaneous decision where this guide told us, I could take you now, we can start driving, and then you can hike tomorrow morning. And so we had to quickly pack a bag and knew that we were going to have to hike with it. So I had to be very, I had to be very decisive about kind of what I would need to pack. And honestly, I think the most important thing I brought with me was a headlamp, a head torch, because we ended up having to hike in the dark the next day when we were waiting for our little wooden cart to pick us up. And that ended up being really, really helpful. Luckily, the altitude wasn't as much of a problem for me there, but just the basic first aid kit was helpful. Having snacks, because as Rodrigo mentioned, a lot of the stores weren't open. We kind of had to go in prepared to find whatever we would find in that, in the town. But I think the security piece of it was really important to sort of stay in constant touch with people back in our newsroom. Luckily, we have a great security team in London that was always kind of checking in, whether it was, letting them know when things were escalating during a protest, or letting them know we had gotten back safe. But, it was a lot of logistics in this particular trip. But I just, as Rodrigo mentioned, just the exhaustion really hits, especially when you're at these high altitudes. I remember getting back from that long journey back from Machu Picchu, and it was like, we finally went to bed at like 2 a.m. and then I had to wake up the next morning and write the story, in a few hours the next day in like the altitude of Cusco. Which, when I'd been there just sort of reporting, I didn't feel it, but suddenly when you sit down to write, it's like my head was just throbbing. So I think it was, you realize that it does hit you after a while, and the coca tea helped, and, some random medicine I found at a pharmacy along the way.
Okay. And Alex, what was your experience with this, and how you prepared for it, and how you dealt with those sort of personal challenges?
Yeah, I mean, logistically, it was just kind of being prepared, having satellite phone and making sure we're checking in and people know where we're kind of at all times, especially in these kind of like rural mountain areas where there's zero service and things aren't working always. On top of that, like like all those things add up. It's just a lot of stress, right? Stress not knowing when you're going to get there, not knowing if you're going to be able to get through. We had like a car issues too at one point, and then on top of that, you have to file and do all these stories. And then yeah, there's also kind of the emotional burden, because you're going to these places where that suffer these really violent, traumatic events, and you're asking repeatedly people to tell you about what is most likely the worst and most painful day in their life. And they're crying and really having a tough time getting through it. And it's just having to kind of put that aside for later and focus on kind of the job, right? And do your best to kind of tell this person's story. And yeah, luckily, I guess after that, I was able to see family, and that was good. Reuters offers a good counseling service too that I take advantage of, and it helps kind of unpack all of that and kind of ease the emotional aftermath of kind of, absorbing all of that kind of emotion and sadness and trauma and trying to make sense of it.
Okay, thank you, Alex, for sharing that. Well, I've got some more questions, but let's open to the floor. Chad, I don't know if you can see the questions that we have any so far that we could throw to the panel.
Yes, we have a couple lined up. Our first question is from Bill. What do you all think will happen? Is the country breaking into pieces? Is this the disintegration of the global South? Big question. Who wants to try and tackle that one first?
What do you think will happen? I think I actually spoke to this academic who studied social conflicts in Peru. And it was interesting because she was talking about how this is pretty unique in terms of other conflicts, and the fact that usually the government gives concessions or some type of plan. This one has been more violent than the others. And she was talking about kind of it coming in waves, kind of like what Rodrigo said, that now, because most of the protests are happening in this informal economy, people need to go and like collect funds. They need to rest. They need to get supplies in, because a lot of cities are blockaded and they can't get supplies. So this is definitely like a lull. And she just doesn't see these people backing down without some type of concrete solution or concession or negotiation from the government. So it's very complicated to ever predict what happens in Peru. But I think kind of in the short term, things aren't looking well for uniting the country. If anything, kind of the rhetoric from the government and everything that's been happening has been further dividing it. And I don't know where that would go. I don't know if will lead to the disintegration of the global South. I think that might be a little too much to say off of this, but it's definitely not, for Peru at least, going towards a path of conciliation so far.
No, and also I think that the problem is that if even if the government called a new election, they are not candidates, because they are not like political parties that anybody like, or they are organized. So probably one of the problems they could face is that they call elections, and now they will have another problem, because anyone that is going to be elected is going to be in a big problem, because you can't solve all these problems in 6 months or in 1 year. So that's why I think it's I agree with Alex. It's very complicated, because people want a new constitution, people want a new Congress, and people want a new president altogether. Plus, the problem now that the government is facing is that they are not like great leaders that are leading these protests. So you want all these things, we need to negotiate that, but with whom? Because you have like a whole province that is all together like protesting in Puno, in Ayacucho, in Apurimac, in Cusco, but there is not a leader to talk and to say, okay, It's not in Bolivia, Evo Morales, years ago, that he was the leader of the protest. So you have to talk to him or to their people to negotiate a solution for Bolivia. The problem here is that right now, there is not that, so I think that makes things even more complicated.
Yeah, and I think I saw a UN expert that was sent to Peru described it as a crisis of credibility in the country, and I think that extends to all of their institutions. I mean, there's no trust in in the government, in the Congress, in the media, in many members of civil society. It just seems like there needs to come, they need to see some sort of someone step forward that inspires trust and credibility and confidence. And it seems like that's really lacking at every level.
Just to push on one of these things, this sort of crisis of confidence in the institutions. Alex, I know you spent several days ensconced inside Congress. And Congress, I think, has about a 5% or so approval rating in Peru, incredibly low. What was that experience like? Seeing the kind of the inside of the sausage, watching the kind of the Congress try and move towards new elections. What did you get from that in terms of this sort of ungovernability of the country?
Yeah, it was a very fragmented sausage, not very united, and I guess most of it too. It's just that there is very little kind of incentive for a lot of them to work together. Maybe there seemed to be no urgency in solving this crisis. A lot of politicians there seemed to be interested in kind of promoting their party, promoting their own career, kind of doing things for what's small, for small reasons, not necessarily for what could be best for the entire country. And yeah, it just seemed like just a disconnect with the lack of a disconnect with kind of what was going on in these other parts of the country, like Puno and Cusco, and it felt like the urgency wasn't there, and the urgency was more towards kind of scoring political points. So it was understandable, I guess, why their approval rating is so low, and kind of these you would see these petty arguments, these petty infightings, these like technicalities that they would use to kill something that like the country is clamoring for. So when you spend some time there, it's kind of hard to see a solution coming out of that body too.
Thank you, Alex. Chad, do we have any more questions? I've seen a few pop up, but I can't see them fully yet from there.
We sure do. We have a question from Jorge, who says, it's been reported in the local press that one of the demands that protesters have is a constitutional assembly in order to write a new constitution. Is your sense that this is a priority among people you came in contact with?
My sense was that, I mean, I think that, there were definitely lots of people demanding a new constitution. But I think every person that, you talk to at a protest has a different reason for being there and a different demand and a different priority. And it kind of depends on what, what region they're from. It depends on, I think earlier on, there was so much of, the focus kind of shifted as protests continued, I feel like, as well. But there definitely, I mean, that was one of the demands that I just think about this one, really the largest kind of first large protest we saw in Lima. I think it was January 19th. The signs basically that everyone was holding mentioned, the resignation of Dina Boluarte, the dissolution of Congress, and the new constitution. Those were really sort of the main demands. And yeah, so it came up a lot, but I think it really depends on who you talk to and what their priority was.
Yeah, I think that I think that protesters, mostly in the South, they are demanding a new constitution. The problem is that in Lima, people, the people in Lima are not so happy about all this situation, because the economy is getting worse, and they feel also that a new constitution, we have the example, they say that the example is Chile, where they, after a big turmoil, political turmoil, they vote for a new constitution. They work in a new constitution almost for 1 year, and then people vote against that constitution. So lots of people in mostly Lima doubt about that solution, that is not going to be the solution of this conflict. So as you know, as Samantha said, it all depends of who you talk. You know, if you talk to people in Lima, probably, or people in the north, you have another idea of what is going on. If you go to the south, for sure, people are demanding a new constitution.
Just quickly, I'd say a lot of people, yeah, were asking for it, but I think the number one I encountered always was just the president resigning. That seemed to be everyone's like number one, was Dina Boluarte's resignation.
Yeah, and you know that is also an interesting point about, because Dina Boluarte is also Quechua. She has indigenous roots. So, and the people in the south think that she's like she's working for the powerful people in Lima, not for them. So it's interesting. It's probably the first woman president of the country. She has an indigenous root. At the same time, people want her to renounce. So it's a big tragedy. the whole thing. It's very chaotic. It's sad.
Yes, and she never really had much of a chance, right? The way she came into power in that sort of vacuum after Castillo. She was always going to be the sort of target of everyone's anger about Castillo's impeachment and arrest.
And I guess to bounce off that, what Rodrigo said about her being Quechua, something that came up a lot in the South is that they felt, a lot of people felt more betrayed by that. That they were like, oh, she was supposed to be one of us, and then now we have all these protesters who've been killed when she came into power. So that was also just an interesting element of it.
Thanks, guys. Chad, I saw a couple more pop up in the
Yes. We have a question from Jennifer, who asks, how have international responses and actors affected protesters, if at all?
I think at the time I was there, they felt that there really wasn't enough of a response. You know, that I don't know how protesters would feel today. I was there in, you know, late January, but they felt that, you know, and especially like when I would mention that I was working for a US newspaper, they would say, you know, why isn't the US doing more? And I think that there was a feeling that there wasn't a very kind of forceful response. And, you know, especially to the deaths and to the, you know, to human rights concerns in the country. And so that was part of the reason, at least, you know, when I was there, what the message they were trying to send from, you know, Machu Picchu and from these strikes is to try to get the attention of international actors, in part because they don't trust anyone in their own country. That really, as we mentioned, the institutions, you know, across the board, you know, did not inspire much confidence.
There was quite a divided reaction from some of the international community, right? There was some around Latin America who were very critical and remained very critical of Boluarte. Others who were obviously a lot more guarded and cautious with their early statements in terms of sort of supporting her presidency and trying to support stability. Alex, Rodrigo, anything you sort of see from that? I mean, we had Mexico, Colombia very critical, the US, and European countries obviously more sort of in support of her with warnings about the violence.
Yeah, I know. Yeah, here Boric here kind of criticized the crackdown on protests. In terms of, sorry, I guess I didn't. What was your question?
No, just in terms of what you saw on the ground, as in were people crossed angry that some global powers have been relatively supportive of Boluarte, and I suppose others have been more critical. But there was a sort of a consensus early on to kind of try and get behind her a little bit in terms of avoiding total meltdown.
It was interesting. I guess most of the people I encountered didn't kind of mention foreign powers. They mostly mentioned foreign organizations. They, like Sam said, they wanted, you know, the OAS to come in. They wanted the UN to come in. They were asking why these organizations weren't coming in. I didn't necessarily hear much about specific countries, but yeah, it was more like, yeah, why isn't there more of a international response from these organizations. And that's kind of also why they were more willing to talk to us, because they were saying that if their stories got out, it would be more likely that these organizations would kind of take their case and intervene.
Thank you, Alex. Chad, do we have any more?
Yes. Jonathan asks, what mistakes, if any, have you noticed other media make?
I think early on, we all were trying to understand what exactly these protesters stood for. And I think that there was a lot of criticism at first of the press in general describing all protesters as Castillo supporters, which was true in many cases, and maybe early on was true, particularly true. But I think as the protests evolved, it really became a much larger protest about, condemning the government as a whole and, against Boluarte, and not necessarily just calling for Castillo's release. I think that it took a while for all of us as journalists to really understand what was going on here and, the demands that these protesters had and how much further it reached than just, their, former president.
Alex, Rodrigo, you see any sort of different perspective on that?
No, and probably the mistake is of some colleagues is not to take here Samantha and Alex they took the risk of going to these places, to these remote areas, and to travel and to suffer trying to tell that story, that it was complicated but it was important. The problem with some colleagues is or some media is that they prefer to stay in Lima and to tell the story from Lima. And it's very difficult, really. In Lima, it was really interesting to see the people from these remote areas to come to the city and to protest in Lima. That was a good story, but it's a totally different thing to go to these areas, to these rural areas, and to understand why people are demanding. Because the demands, as Samantha said, it's not only about the president, it's not only about Castillo, it's about people that they don't have schools, they don't have clean water, that they have like a big mining projects near their towns, but they still live in a very poor conditions. And you can only tell that story if you take the time of going there. If you take the risk of going to these remote areas, in these roads, and to try to tell that story. So the mistake is not taking that risk, taking that support of your company, of your newspaper or agency to go there. That is the biggest problem. Not only in Peru, I think that it's the biggest problem with the crisis of the budget. Also, it's very sometimes it's. Can I go here? No, there's no money. How much is going? The first question is how much is going to cost? It's not, do you think it's really important to go? No. The first question is how much is going to cost? So yeah, that's a problem we are facing nowadays.
Thank you, Rodrigo. I think I saw a couple more come in, Chad.
Yes, we have a couple more questions. Bill asks, to what extent is this a confrontation between the former Spanish governing class and the indigenous population?
I think a lot of those tensions came to the surface, especially once, I think at the beginning, everyone kept mentioning, even the president, Dina Boluarte said, Puno isn't Peru, would say things like to try to distinguish these largely indigenous communities and in the South and in other parts of the country, distinguish them from, the rule following people in Lima. And I think that a lot of, especially, when I was there during this big protest, when people were coming from these remote regions to Lima to make these demands. And I think, you saw in the news and, even just talking to people in Lima, this kind of these very, frankly, racist stereotypes kind of connecting indigenous populations in Peru to, terrorists, to vandals, to, people who spoke Spanish differently from them, who, it just all of that kind of comes to the surface in moments like this. So I think that there's some deep rooted tensions there.
And I think that, yeah, it's very clear, as I said before, the country, it's a model of economic, it's a model of the economic progress. Everybody in Latin America talks about the Peru economy, saying that is the best example of what governments need to do, how the central bank has to work in order to have a stable economy and to have a stability. In this, it's incredible. All these, protests erupted 3 months ago, and there is not a big devaluation. There are some economic problems that are like doing life more complicated to Peruvians. Prices are getting high, but at the same time, it's very stable. So how you understand why people protest, saying that they are still super poor, that they can have a better life in their communities with this economic boom? It's like, so it's, and this comes the confrontation, the historic confrontation. If in Lima things go very well, if the economy is growing, why we still live very bad? So we want an explanation of that. And the explanation is the history of the country. It's things change, but for some regions, for a lot of communities, is still the same probably life that they have like 100 years ago.
Yeah, and speaking of that too, a lot of, Peru is the world's second largest copper producer, and a lot of the mines are located in the south, where these protests took place. And that was like a big kind of topic of protesters who were demanding, they're like, there's so much wealth coming out of our region. And yeah, we visited some communities that were kind of surrounding these mines, and some of them had no electricity, no running water. And these are kind of historical things, like both Sam and Rodrigo were saying, where these are populations that have felt exploited, that they've felt racism, they felt things for centuries, really. And this is just kind of another nail in the coffin, really, for their anger, for their resentment. So it is a big factor, I would say, and it's pretty apparent when you talk to any of these protesters from these regions where there's large indigenous communities.
Thank you, guys. Is there one more chat before we wrap up?
Yeah, there is one last question from Diana. Would you say there's been a fair interest by international media outlets in documenting the human rights violations that took place during the protests?
I think everyone's definitely, I think if there's one thing we've all done is to try to focus on, on the deaths that have taken place, and to try to kind of, hold the government accountable. But I think documenting them is quite difficult because you get very little information from the authorities. Alex mentioned, some documentation he was able to get. And I think some of us on the ground are able to do interviews and do some, reporting and try to understand exactly what happened. But, there've been so many of them, dozens of people have died. It's so unclear what the circumstances were in many cases. And I think, there are now human rights researchers that have been on the ground and who have been, releasing more information in more detail. And I think a lot of the local press, in particular, like Ojo Público has done a really good job of documenting some of these, human rights violations. But it's quite difficult to understand exactly what, has gone on with each of these deaths.
Yeah, I would agree. I would say the interest is definitely there, and it is complicated. That's something we tried to do, and hopefully successfully at points. But yeah, like Sam said, there's a lot of roadblocks, both literal and also within the government and within security organizations, the police. the military to actually concretely document something of that nature. But the interest is there, I would say.
Yeah, and I think that in this case, there is not like I don't think that there is like a particular agenda of the US or the State Department or the media to do something, to tell one part of the story in Peru. I don't think that there is pressure to do that. I think that the journalists in Peru, the international media work like really free and trying to understand the conflict and trying to do as much as possible. Even as I said, sometimes it's a forgotten story because now, you know, how the media works now is Ukraine, the anniversary, and then tomorrow is something else, and then we forgot about Peru until something really bad happened again, and then we are, but I think that this because of how the media work in general, but I think that the international media did a good job trying to understand the complexity of the conflict. I think that there is not a big interest in telling in telling a bad story or trying to convince people to thinking one side or other side. I think that our colleagues are trying to do a good job in the ground.
Brilliant. Well, look, Rodrigo and Alex, Samantha, I think that covers, a huge amount of ground. As you all say, we've covered in depth the sort of heat of the Peru story. Now is the uncertainty in what happens next, which will rumble on for a while, and hopefully we will be able to keep some attention on Peru going forward as they try and find their path. I want to say thank you to all of you, the three panelists, for sharing their experience. Thank you to everyone who's dialed in and listened and asked questions, probing the experience that our reporters have had on the ground. So thank you all very much, and hopefully we will be able to join again soon for a next topic. Anyway, Rodrigo, Samantha, and Alex, thank you so much.
Thanks
Thank
a lot.
you.
Thank you.
Cheers, guys.